Chapter 60, Lady Visakha's Grief. After Ambalatika, the Buddha went to teach in Nalanda and then to Kampa, a large city in the state of Anga. Anga was a populous and fertile region under the jurisdiction of King Bimbisara. There the Buddha dwelled in a cool forest by Gagara Lake, where many fragrant lotus flowers grew. People came in great numbers to listen to the Buddha teach. A young wealthy Brahmin named Sonandanda also came to meet the Buddha. Sonandanda was admired in the region for his astute intelligence. Several of his friends discouraged him from paying a visit to the Buddha. They felt a visit by Sonandanda would grant too much prestige to the monk Gautama. Sonandanda smiled and said that he did not want to pass up an opportunity to meet a man like the Buddha, who was known to possess uncommon insight. Such a chance only presented itself once in 1,000 years, he said. I must go to deepen my own knowledge, said Sonandanda. I want to see in which areas monk Gautama exceeds me, and in which areas I exceed monk Gautama. Several hundred Brahmins decided to join Sonandanda. They walked to Gagara Lake, placing their faith in Sonandanda. They were sure he would show the teaching of their caste to be superior to that of the Buddha. They knew Sonandanda would not bring shame on the Brahmins. When Sonandanda stood before the Buddha, who was already surrounded by dense crowds, he faltered for a moment, not knowing how to begin. The Buddha assisted him by speaking first. He said, Sonandanda, can you tell us what characteristics are essential to be a true Brahmin? If necessary, please cite the Vedas as evidence. Sonandanda was pleased. The Vedas were his particular field of speciality. He said, Monk Gautama, an authentic Brahmin possesses 5 characteristics: an attractive appearance, skill in chanting and performing rituals, purity of blood that can be traced back 7 generations, virtuous actions, and wisdom. The Buddha asked, of these 5 characteristics, which are the most essential? Can one still be a true Brahmin if any of the characteristics are absent? Sonandanda reflected and responded that the last 2 characteristics were the only ones truly indispensable. Physical beauty, skill in chanting and performing rituals, and purity of blood were not absolutely essential. Hearing Sonandanda say this disturbed the 500 Brahmins that had accompanied him. They all stood and shook their arms to challenge Sonadanda's statements. They felt he had been swayed by the Buddha's questioning and that his responses were an embarrassment to their caste. The Buddha turned to them and said, honored guests, if you have faith in Sonandanda, please be quiet and allow him to continue speaking with me. If you no longer have faith in him, ask him to sit down and I will speak with any one of you instead. Everyone fell silent. Sonandanda looked at the Buddha and said, Monk Gautama, please allow me to address a few words to my friends. Sonandanda turned to his fellows and pointed to a young man sitting in the front row of their ranks. He said, do you see my cousin Angaka here? Angaka is a handsome and elegant youth. His demeanor is refined and noble. Few, except Monk Gautama, can compete with his handsome looks. Angaka is well versed in the Vedas. He possesses skill in chanting and performing rituals. He can claim purity of blood traced back 7 generations on both sides of his family. No one can deny that he possesses these 3 characteristics. But let us suppose that Angaka was a drunkard who murdered, robbed, raped, and lied. Of what value would his attractive looks, chanting skills, and purity of blood be then? Dear friends, we must admit that virtuous action and wisdom are the only two characteristics truly essential to be a true Brahmin. This is a truth for all, not just a private truth for monk Gautama. The crowds applauded with approval. When the applause died down, the Buddha asked Sonadanda, of these two characteristics, virtuous action and wisdom, is one more essential than the other? Sonadanda answered, Monk Gautama, virtuous action develops from wisdom, and wisdom increases thanks to virtuous action. They cannot be separated. It is like using one hand to wash the other, or using one foot to scratch the other. Virtuous action and wisdom assist and nurture each other. Virtuous action enables wisdom to shine forth. Wisdom enables action to grow ever more virtuous. These two qualities are the most precious things in life. The Buddha responded, Excellent, Sonadanda, you speak the truth. Virtuous action and wisdom are the two most precious things in life. Can you tell us more? How can one develop virtuous action and wisdom to the highest degree? Sonadanda smiled and joined his palms. He bowed to the Buddha and said, Master, please guide us. We know the principles, but you are the one who has actually attained the true path. Please tell us how to develop virtuous action and wisdom to the highest degree. The Buddha spoke to them about the path of liberation. He told them of the 3 steps to enlightenment: precepts, concentration, and understanding. Observing the precepts develops concentration. Concentration leads to understanding. Understanding enables one to practice the precepts more deeply. The more deeply the precepts are observed, the greater one's concentration grows. The greater one's concentration, the deeper one's understanding. The Buddha also spoke about meditating on dependent co-arising in order to break through false concepts of permanence and a separate self. Meditating on dependent co-arising enables one to cut the bonds of greed, anger, and ignorance in order to attain liberation, peace, and joy. Sonadanda listened spellbound. When the Buddha was finished, Sonadanda stood up and joined his palms. He said, Master Gautama, please accept my gratitude. You have opened my eyes today. You have led me out of the darkness. Please allow me to take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. I would also like to invite you and all the bhikkhus to my home tomorrow for a meal offering. The enthusiastic exchange that took place that day between the Buddha and young Sonadanda sent waves throughout all levels of society in the region. A large number of Brahmana intellectuals became disciples of the Buddha, including a well-known Brahmin named Ambata and his teacher Pakarasadi in the village of Lakanakala. As more and more young Brahmins became disciples of the Buddha, it became difficult to quell the jealousy and resentment of certain Brahmana teachers and leaders of other religious sects. While they were still staying in Ambalatika, Savasti asked Venerable Moggallana about the different religious movements of the times. Moggallana summarized the main tenets of each sect for him. First of all, there was the sect of Purana Kassapa. His followers were skeptical about morals and ethics, maintaining that good and evil were only concepts that resulted from habit and convention. The followers of Makali Gosala were fatalists. They believed that one's lot in life was predetermined and beyond any individual's power to change. If one attained liberation after 500 or 1,000 years of reincarnation, it was due to one's predetermined fate and not to any special efforts. Ajita Kaskambali taught the doctrine of hedonism. He maintained that humans were comprised of the 4 elements: earth, water, fire, and air. When one died, nothing remained. According to this sect, one should experience as much pleasure as possible while still alive. The sect headed by Paguta Kakayana took the opposite view. They believed that one's true soul and body could never be destroyed. They claimed that humans were comprised of 7 elements: earth, water, fire, air, suffering, happiness, and life energy. Birth and death were merely outward forms that resulted from the temporary combination and dissolution of the 7 elements, while one's true essence was immortal and beyond destruction. Venerable Sariputta and Moggallana had belonged to the sect founded by Sanjaya Belatthiputta. Sanjaya taught a doctrine of relativity. He believed that truth changed according to circumstances, time, and place. What was true for one situation might not be true for another. A person's awareness was the measuring rod of all things. Niganta Nataputta led a sect of ascetics who practiced austerities. They did not wear clothes and they strictly observed the precept against killing other living beings. Niganta taught a kind of dualistic fatalism. He believed that 2 forces, jiva and ajiva, or life and non-life, were the basis of the universe. His sect commanded great respect and influence in the society of the times. The bhikkhus frequently came into contact with Nataputta's ascetics. Both communities shared a common respect for life, but there were many differences between the 2 communities, and some of Niganta's followers bitterly opposed the bhikkhus. Venerable Moggallana found the views of the ascetics too extreme, and he did not hesitate to express his opinion. Because of that, many of the ascetics were particularly hostile to Venerable Moggallana. The Buddha returned to Savatthi and stayed in Eastern Park. There was a constant stream of visitors. One morning, Lady Visakha came to see him. Her hair and clothes were drenched with rain. The Buddha asked her, "Visakha, where have you been? Why are your clothes and hair so wet?" Lady Visakha wept. "Lord, my little grandson just died. I wanted to come to see you, but in my grief, I forgot to take my hat or a parasol to protect me from the rain." "How old was your grandson, Visakha? How did he die?" "Lord, he was only 3 years old. He died of typhoid fever." "The poor little one. Visakha, how many children and grandchildren do you have?" "Lord, I have 16 children. 9 are married. I had 8 grandchildren. Now there are only 7. Visakha, you like having a lot of grandchildren, don't you?" "Oh yes, Lord. The more the better. Nothing would make me happier than to have as many children and grandchildren as there are people in Savatthi." "Visakha, do you know how many people die each day in Savatthi?" "Lord, sometimes 9 or 10, but at least one person dies every day in Savatthi. There is no day without a death in Savatthi." "Visakha, if your children and grandchildren were as numerous as the people of Savatthi, your hair and clothes would be as soaked as they are today, every day." Visakha joined her palms. "I understand. I really don't want as many children and grandchildren as there are people in Savatthi. The more attachments one has, the more one suffers. You have often taught me this, but I always seem to forget. The Buddha smiled gently. Visakha told him, Lord, you usually return from your travels only just before the rainy season begins. Your disciples miss you greatly the rest of the year. We come to the monastery, but it seems empty without you. We walk around your hut a few times and then return home, not knowing what else to do. The Buddha said, Visakha, diligent practice of the teaching is more important than paying visits. When you come to the monastery, you have a chance to listen to other venerables teach the Dharma. You can ask them questions to assist you in your practice. The teaching and the teacher are one. Please don't neglect your practice simply because I am not here. Venerable Ananda, who was standing nearby, proposed an idea. It would be nice to plant a Bodhi tree here at the monastery. That way, whenever disciples come to visit and you are gone, they could visit the Bodhi tree in your place. They could even bow to it as though bowing to you. We could place a stone altar beneath the tree where the disciples could offer flowers. They could walk slowly round the tree while practicing the contemplation of the Buddha. Lady Visakha said, That is a wonderful idea, but where will you find a Bodhi tree? Ananda answered, I can ask for a seed from the Bodhi tree in Uruvela, where the Buddha attained awakening. Don't worry, I will acquire the seed, sprout it, and tend the tree. Lady Visakha felt lighter and comforted. She bowed to the Buddha and to Venerable Ananda, and then returned home. Chapter 61, The Lion's Roar. That same retreat season, Ananda asked a question about dependent co-arising, and so the Buddha taught the bhikkhus about the 12 links in the chain of existence. He explained, the teaching on dependent co-arising is most profound and subtle. Do not think it can be grasped through words and discourse. Bhikkhus, thanks to hearing the teaching on dependent co-arising, Venerable Uruvela Kassapa entered the path of the true Dharma. Venerable Sariputta, another of our most respected brothers, entered the path thanks to hearing a gatha concerning dependent co-arising. Contemplate the nature of dependent co-arising during every moment. When you look at a leaf or a raindrop, meditate on all the conditions, near and distant, that have contributed to the presence of that leaf or raindrop. Know that the world is woven of interconnected threads. This is because that is. This is not because that is not. This is born because that is born. This dies because that dies. The birth and death of any Dharma are connected to the birth and death of all other dharmas. The one contains the many, and the many contains the one. Without the one, there cannot be the many. Without the many, there cannot be the one. This is the marvelous truth of the teaching on dependent co-arising. If you look deeply into the nature of all dharmas, you will be able to transcend all anxiety concerning birth and death. You will break through the circle of birth and death. Bhikkhus, the interconnected links consist of many layers and levels, but 4 realms can be distinguished: chief causes, contributory causes, the immediately preceding moment as cause, and objects as cause. A chief cause is the first condition necessary to give rise to a phenomenon. For example, a grain of rice is the chief cause necessary to give rise to a rice plant. Contributory causes are supportive conditions. In the case of a grain of rice, these include sun, rain, and earth, which enable the seed to grow into a rice plant. The immediately preceding moment as cause is an uninterrupted process and serves as an underlying cause. Without this continual process, the rice plant's growth would be interrupted before reaching fruition. Objects as cause refer to objects of consciousness. A grain of rice and all the near and distant conditions that make the presence of the rice plant possible are objects of consciousness. They cannot be separated from consciousness. Mind is a basic condition for the existence of all dharmas. Bhikkhus. Suffering exists because of the presence of birth and death. What gives rise to birth and death? Ignorance. Birth and death are first of all mental notions. They are the product of ignorance. If you look deeply and penetrate the causes of all things, you will overcome ignorance. Once you have overcome ignorance, you will transcend all thoughts of birth and death. Transcending all thoughts of birth and death, you will overcome all anxieties and sorrows. Bhikkhus. There is the concept of death because there is the concept of birth. These wrong views are based on a false view of the self. There is a false view of the self because there is grasping. There is grasping because there is desire. There is desire because one does not see into the true nature of feelings. One does not see into the true nature of feelings because one is caught up in the contact that takes place between the sense organs and their objects. One is caught up in the contact that takes place between the sense organs and their objects because one's mind is not clear and calm. One's mind is not clear and calm because there are drives and impulses. These drives and impulses are due to ignorance. These 12 links of the chain of existence are connected to each other. In each link, you can see the other 11 links. If one link is missing, the other 11 will be missing. These 12 links are death, birth, becoming, grasping, craving, feelings, contact, the 6 sense organs, name and form, consciousness, drives and impulses, and ignorance. Bhikkhus. Ignorance underlies all 12 links of the chain of existence. Thanks to the contemplation on the nature of dependent co-arising, we can dispel ignorance in order to transcend all anxieties and sorrows. An enlightened person walks over the waves of birth and death and does not drown in them. An enlightened person uses the 12 links of the chain of existence like the wheels of a carriage. An enlightened person lives in the very midst of the world, but is never submerged by it. Bhikkhus, do not try and run away from birth and death. You need only rise above them. Transcending birth and death is the attainment of great being. In a Dharma discussion several days later, Venerable Maha Kassapa reminded the community that the Buddha had given the teaching on dependent co-arising many times in the past, and that this teaching could be considered the heart of the way of awakening. He reminded the community that the Buddha had once used a bunch of reeds to illustrate the teaching on dependent co-arising. The Lord had said that things do not need a creator, that they arise from one another. Ignorance causes drives and impulses calls ignorance, just as reeds lean on one another to stand, and if one reed falls, the other reeds also fall. This is true of all things in the universe. The one creates the many, and the many the one. If we look deeply, we can see the one in the many, and the many in the one. During that same retreat season, several Brahmins conspired to falsely accuse the Buddha of sleeping with a woman and making her pregnant. They found an attractive young Brahmana woman named Sinka and told her that the Buddha had caused a rapid decline in the faith of their ancestors by luring many young men to become his disciples. Anxious to protect her faith, Sinka agreed to the plan. Every day she went to Jetavana, dressed in a beautiful sari and carrying a fresh bouquet of flowers. She did not arrive in time for the Dharma talks, but waited outside the Dharma hall as people left to return home. At first, whenever anyone asked her where she was going or what she was doing, she only smiled. After several days, she answered coyly, "I'm going where I'm going." After several weeks of such vague comments, she began to answer, "I'm going to visit monk Gautama." And finally, she was heard to exclaim, "Sleeping at Jetavana is delightful." Such words burned the ears of many people. Some lay people began to feel doubts and suspicions, but no one said anything. One day, Sinka came to one of the Buddha's Dharma talks. Her belly was noticeably round. In the middle of the Buddha's discourse, she stood up and loudly said, "Teacher Gautama, you speak eloquently about the Dharma. You are held in high esteem, but you care nothing for this poor woman made pregnant by you. The child I carry is your own. Are you going to take responsibility for your own child?" A wave of shock passed through the community. Everyone looked up at the Buddha. The Buddha only smiled calmly and replied, "Miss, only you and I can know whether or not your claims are true." The Buddha's calm smile made Sinka feel uneasy, but she retorted, "That's right, only you and I know whether my claims are true." The community could no longer suppress their astonishment. Several people stood up in anger. Sinka suddenly felt afraid that people would beat her. She looked for a way to escape, but in her panic, she ran into a post and stumbled. As she strained to stand back up, a large round block of wood fell from where it was tied onto her abdomen and landed on her foot. She cried out in pain and grabbed her crushed toes. Her stomach was now perfectly flat. A sigh of relief rose from the crowd. Several people began laughing and others derided Sinka. Bhikkhuni Kema stood up and gently assisted Sinka out of the hole. When the two women were gone, the Buddha resumed his talk as if nothing had happened. The Buddha spoke. Community, the way of enlightenment, can tear down the walls of ignorance, just as light can disperse the shadows. The Four Noble Truths, impermanence, non-self, dependent co-arising, the four establishments of mindfulness, the seven factors of awakening, the three gates, and the Noble Eightfold Path have all been proclaimed to the world like a lion's roar, dispelling countless false doctrines and narrow views. The lion is king of the beasts. When he leaves his den, he stretches and gazes out over all the directions. Before seeking his prey, he lets forth a mighty roar that causes the other creatures to tremble and flee. Birds fly high, crocodiles dive beneath the water, foxes slip into their holes. Even village elephants, decked in fancy belts and ornaments and shaded by golden parasols, run away at the sound of that roar. Community, The proclamation of the way of enlightenment is like the lion's roar. False doctrines fear and tremble. When impermanence, non-self and dependent co-arising are proclaimed, all those who have long sought false security in ignorance and forgetfulness must awaken, celestial beings as well as humans. When a person sees the dazzling truth, he exclaims, "We embraced dangerous views for so long, taking the impermanent to be permanent, and believing in the existence of a separate self. We took suffering to be pleasure, and look at the temporary as if it were eternal. We mistook the false for the true. Now the time has come to tear down all the walls of forgetfulness and false views." Community, the way of enlightenment, allows humanity to remove the thick veil of false views. When an enlightened person appears, the way echoes like the majestic sound of the rising tide. When the tide rises, all false views are swept away. Community, people are easily caught by 4 traps. The first is attachment to sensual desires. The second is attachment to narrow views. The third is doubt and suspicion. The fourth is false view of self. The way of enlightenment helps people overcome the 4 great traps. Community, the teaching on dependent co-arising will enable you to overcome every obstacle and trap. Contemplate the nature of interdependence in your daily life, in your body, feelings, mind, and objects of mind. The next day, in the main hall, Ananda repeated the Buddha's Dharma talk. He named it Sutra of the Lion's Roar. That retreat season, many bhikkhus fell ill with malaria. Many grew thin and pale and no longer had the strength to go out begging for themselves. Other bhikkhus readily shared their food with them, but much of the food contained rice and curry, which was too harsh on the stomachs of the sick. The Buddha gave permission to lay disciples to prepare special dishes for the sick bhikkhus. They cooked food that was easily digested, such as rice porridge, with wholesome ingredients like honey, milk, cane sugar, and oil. Thanks to these foods, the bhikkhus slowly regained their health. One day, after sitting meditation, the Buddha heard the squawking of a great number of crows. When he went to investigate, he found a number of bhikkhus tossing the special foods prepared for the sick bhikkhus to the crows. They explained that a number of brothers had felt too ill to eat that morning. The hour of noon had passed, and the bhikkhus were not to partake of food after noon. When the Buddha asked why they didn't save the special foods for the following day, he was reminded that food was not to be kept overnight. The Buddha told them that sick bhikkhus could be relieved of the precepts not to eat anything after the noon hour, and if certain foods would keep, they could be saved overnight. Not long after, a physician from the capital paid a visit to the Venerable Sariputta. He suggested that sick bhikkhus be served a dish of special herbs and ingredients. Thanks to that, the bhikkhus regained their health more quickly.